Oswaith dda, good evening. Oswaith dda o Ynys Môn, Gareth Roberts dwi, a fi di ysgrifennydd Cymru dros Europe. My name is Gareth Roberts, and I'm the Secretary of Wales for Europe, and I'm looking after the technical side today. I live in the village with a long name. I won't bore you with that. And we have two presidents. This meeting has been billed as the meeting of the two presidents. And I know one of them, Anthony Slaughter, president of the Greens in Wales. He's our president as well, and he contributes to our meetings and to public meetings as well. We're very pleased to see him today. And then I don't know, David Martin, but he's there at the bottom of the screen. And to be honest, David, your CV looks like something fantastic.
Very kind of you.
I'm very pleased to see you. Right, Charles. Charles is supposed to chair this. Charles is our chairman. Chair meetings. Charles, are you there?
Gareth, I don't think Charles is with us yet.
Yes, he is. He's just joined.
He is.
Okay. I just arrived. I've been wrestling with my laptop.
Who won?
I won. I've got a baseball bat.
Well, Charles, you're our chairman and you're chairing this meeting. Both of our speakers here. I leave it over to you. Okay?
Okay, well, all I was going to do is to welcome everybody and ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves. So A is first in the alphabet, so we'll ask Anthony to introduce himself first. Then please, Anthony.
Thank you, Jill, Charles and Gareth. It's really good to be here. Good to see so many familiar names and some unfamiliar names, and really a pleasure to meet you, David. I'm looking forward to our discussion. As Gareth said, I'm Anthony Slaughter, currently the President of Wales for Europe, and with my other hat on, I'm the leader of the Green Party in Wales, Wales Green Party. A long-time campaigner, as many of you already know, long-time campaigner, but with my political hat on and my campaigning hat on during the referendum and second vote campaign. A founding member of the Vale of Glamorgan for Europe and a long-standing member and previous committee member of Wales for Europe. Really pleased to be here, looking forward to a discussion. This subject is becoming more and more topical. So really looking to hear the sort of reflections and contrasts and similarities between our campaigning activity and the situation in Scotland. So over to you, David, and thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome, David. Over to you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, go ahead, David.
Sorry, yeah, no, it's a great pleasure to be with you all and to meet my Welsh counterparts. It's nice to link up the Celtic fringes. My background is former member of the European Parliament. When I want to push the line, I was 35 years an MEP from 1984 to 2019, which makes me the longest serving British MEP. I was also a vice president of the European Parliament for 15 years. Inside the Parliament, my main issues were trade policy and, in my earlier days, regional policy, which of course was key to both Wales and Scotland at one time. Probably my proudest achievement as an MEP was I steered through the so-called Reshare programme, which literally brought millions to the former Welsh and Scottish coalfields. Now I'm the honorary president of the European Movement in Scotland, and delighted to be so, and continue to try and fly the flag for European issues and interests.
Okay, thank you, David. Now, how do you two want to proceed? Our normal procedure in this sort of event is the guest speaker speaks for a little while until they get fed up, and then we do a question and answer. So you can do that individually if you want to, or you can do the two Ronnies act and sort of interact with each other for 15 minutes. It's entirely up to you, Anthony and David. I'll hand it over to you to decide how you want to proceed.
I've got a couple of questions and observations that might help to kickstart it. But yeah, the Q&A is always the best part of this, so try not to take up too much time because everyone's got opinions and questions, all equally valid. I think the first place to start would just be interesting, for me, definitely personally, is the reflections from Scotland and the result, because obviously it was such a different result in Scotland, and it was such a decisive result in Scotland. It wasn't a narrow one like the others, the 48-52 thing. It was a very clear vote from the people of Scotland to remain in the EU. So I'd be interested, David, in your reflections on the aftermath of the campaign, of the referendum, and the ongoing impacts, because we know that businesses in Wales, one of our focuses, are really suffering from the impacts of Brexit. And we've seen the is it 48 million, 43 million folly of the border post. It's now no longer needed in Holyhead. And what we're also seeing in Wales is an increased awareness, very definitely an increased awareness in the damages of Brexit. And I think it's safe to say that we are seeing growing support. And I would argue it's probably reaching a majority now, if it hasn't already, of people who do think it would be better for Wales to be back integrated, definitely for stronger ties with the EU, and ultimately back in the EU, either as part of the UK or as Wales. So I'd just really be interested on how that contrasts to Scotland, given that Scotland did vote quite strongly to remain.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of kicking off, Anthony. I think the most immediate impact of the referendum was probably, as you say, the fact that almost 2/3 of Scots voted to remain in the European Union. And I guess it reinforced something that was already there to some extent, but it reinforced this idea that we were quite distinct from, I suppose, the rest of the UK, but specifically from England. So it reinforced a national identity, if you like, for want of a better description. And I think it also, something I'm rather proud of, and I think Wales actually falls into a similar category here, but also I think reinforced not just the Brexit debate, but the whole migration debate we've had since Brexit, this idea of civic identity in Scotland, which is based much more on values and residency compared to what we, and it's not all English by any stretch of the imagination, but compared to this view you now get coming out of certain parts of England that identity is about ethnicity. And I think we've managed so far, and I hope we can, and I'm not saying we're perfect, but we've so far managed to escape much of that. I guess the other thing that it did was, post-Brexit, was the way the British government behaved really started making people question who was taking back control, and taking back control from whom. And kind of couple of events, the fact that the withdrawal bill was opposed both in Scotland and Wales. Of course, in the end, they didn't have the power to stop it, but it showed that we were not comfortable with the way that Brexit was being interpreted. So we accepted the outcome of the referendum UK-wide, but we didn't accept the way it was interpreted. And then sort of coming out of that, emanating from that, the Internal Market Act also showed that this was, well, it was perceived in Scotland, and I can't speak for Wales, but I suspect in Wales as well, as a power grab by Westminster. And so the idea that even those in Scotland or Wales that thought getting out of the EU was bringing back power to the localities, realised it was doing precisely the opposite. Initially, and I'll kind of conclude on this, initially the post-Brexit, Scotland was very active. It was coming out with lots of policy papers, suggestions for alternative arrangements. The then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, set up a standing council in Europe, which I was very happy to be a member of, looking at ways that Scotland could remain engaged with the European Union. I have to be honest and say, and I'm not as connected now with the government, but I feel a lot of the impetus of that has gone, frankly, and I'm not sure we are driving that forward as much as we could and should be now. And perhaps an indication of that is Scotland Europa, which has been in existence for 30 years now almost. The government's announced that they're going to close that next March or April. So I don't think that alone can be interpreted as a sign of disengagement, but it's a rather worrying example. I also sit on a body which I fully approve of, that the government set up, Scottish government set up, to try and keep Scottish environmental legislation aligned with European legislation. And frankly, the analysis that we've been doing in that organisation suggests that's not going terribly well. And now there are reasons for that. The aforementioned Internal Market Act doesn't make that straightforward, but there also seems to be a lack of impetus behind that as well. So I'm a little bit, I was very pleased with the initial reaction. I'm a little bit worried that some of that momentum is going.
I think I tend to agree with you on that. And you've touched on quite a few things I wanted to raise next, as well as the identity question. I think is very important. And obviously in Scotland, the referendum came just 2 years after the independence referendum. So there was a lot of discussion already about what sort of future people wanted for Scotland as a nation. And I was wondering, interested in your thoughts on the overlap between devolution / independence for some people and the results of Brexit. Because what I've noticed in Wales, I think it had exactly, I've got it written in front of me, the Internal Markets Act and the Shared Prosperity Fund. I think there was a growing awareness within both nations that taking back control meant giving it all to Westminster. It was very, and it's been very noticeable in Wales. And I had an experience with my other hat on as Wales Green Party, who'd always had an ambivalent position on Welsh independence. A member brought a motion to our conference, because members make this policy in the Green Party, saying that we should be fully supportive of Welsh independence. And I was inwardly groaning, despite my own position on this, because this is going to be a ding-dong conference. And I was surprised by how overwhelmingly, almost unanimous it was. And I do think that was linked to people had seen that power had been taken off Wales, but relocated to Westminster. And so I'm not here tonight to advocate for the solution to that, but I think it does bring up constitutional considerations, because we're Wales for Europe, your European movement in Scotland. And an interesting thought I had on the way home tonight is, are we campaigning for Wales? We are obviously campaigning for stronger connections, stronger ties between Wales and Europe. Are we campaigning for Wales to rejoin the EU, Scotland to join the EU, or a reformed UK? Because I think we do need to look at the constitutional questions. And very pleased with the Independent Commission on Constitutional Future of Wales looking at these things, because rejoining, which I think everyone in this room ultimately thinks is the way forward, does have quite strong constitutional implications for how the four nations of the UK work together in the future. So I'd be interested in your views on that, and also, because I'm aware we want to let other people in, it's the future of Europe as well fits into that, because very prominent Welsh political journalist Will Hayward wrote a recent book on should Wales be independent? And he took a very agnostic view of, he just looked at all the arguments for and against. And one of the most interesting chapters was his one on, there are a lot of people in pro-Welsh independence or greater devolution who see it as a proxy for getting back into the EU. And so he did this very sort of astute analysis of how long that would actually take. In fact, I don't agree with his timeline. He came up with a timeline of between sort of 15, 20 years before Wales, under what constitutional settlement we have in the future, could rejoin the EU. And that raises the interesting questions of what will the EU look like then? So without chucking too many questions into one mix, we also have the concerns, and when we had Caroline Lucas on recently on one of these events, raising the concerns about the rise of the populist right in Europe, which for me just indicates that we need to be back in the mix sooner rather than later to help counter that. So just interested in your views on how the devolution / independence debate plays out within the campaign to rejoin and strengthen ties with Europe, and how do we help influence and keep the EU as an organisation that we want to be part of and help progress?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a lot.
The latter point is one that I'm particularly worried about at the moment, and I'm not sure what we can do at the moment from the outside, other than through our respective internationals, Green Party speaking to other Green Party members in different parts of Europe, Labour Party members speaking to socialists and so on. But there is a real worry that Europe is, well, I have a real worry that Europe is going in the wrong direction at the present time. It seems to be retreating a bit from green policy. It's certainly on its fringes got some serious questions about human rights at the moment. And the lack of unity, I'm afraid, has shown us to be easy prey for Donald Trump and his policies. And I mean, I won't digress into that, but the so-called trade agreement yesterday looked to me more like a trade retreat rather than a trade agreement. But let's not diverge at the moment into that. We might come on to questions. But in terms of nationalism, I think I would draw a distinction between identity and nationalism. And I would say Scottish identity and Welsh identity certainly have grown, partly as a result of Brexit, but partly just because of the way the world is going, because of broader issues. And there's been a fair number of studies that now show that, 20 years ago, probably including myself, if I was asked what nationality I might have said Scottish and British, or British Scottish, or something along those lines. Now people say Scottish, Welsh, to a much greater extent than adding the British or simply saying they're British. So there's less of an identity with the UK. How that plays into independence is less clear. In fact, Scottish independence didn't, because it was already, let's be honest, it was already pretty high. It didn't increase significantly because of Brexit. And it also created, I noticed David Gow's just put a comment which I entirely agree with. It also had a double-edged impact on the nationalists, because in my youth and when I was first elected, the bulk of the nationalists Scottish nationalists were in favour of independence outside the European Union, and their great model was the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Danes and so on. So not the Danes, but the Swedes and the Finns and so on. When they joined the European Union, that kind of shifted the dial. And then Jim Sillars came up with this very clever idea and logical idea of independence inside the European Union, which was meant to solve all the border problems and other issues. And the bulk of the SNP went along with that, but they always had a section that was never comfortable with that. And interestingly, and this is David Gow's point, that faction has actually had a new life because of Brexit. There's now, I don't know what percentage of the SNP, but there are probably about a quarter of the SNP who think independence, full stop, is the answer. Not independence in the European Union, but independence, full stop, is now the way forward. So it's an interesting shift on that side as well. The other impact that Brexit had is some people who favoured independence, because we left the European Union, became more nervous about it for commercial reasons, trade and so on, because we still do by far the bulk of our trade with the rest of the United Kingdom. And it's not clear there would be borders, but if we were to rejoin the EU and a border existed between us and England, and that's why, of course, we follow all the issues about in alignment very closely. But if there was a border between the two, that would harm us more than we would benefit from joining the European Union. So there'd be a lot of questions to be answered. On the timescale, and this is really, you could make any argument about the timescale. My own, because I actually sat through a series of enlargements in the European Union and watched the negotiations. A lot depends on the political will and on the administrative capability of the country applying and how closely you are already aligned with. And I think in both Scotland and Wales' case, and I'm not advocating this, but if they were to become independent and were to apply to join, it wouldn't be 20 years. It may not even be 10. It would be, I would think, 4 or 5 years would be feasible, but a lot of other impediments could come in the way. And a lot also would depend, as you rightly say, on what kind of EU would be joining at that time. And that's a much more open question than it would have been for me 2 or 3 years ago.
Thanks. That's really encouraging to hear the idea of a shorter timescale. I think that's very encouraging. And I think you're right. Something that troubles me a lot is the idea of internal borders in the United Kingdom. And that's a really good comment from David Gow. So thank you for that, because I don't think that was as prevalent in Welsh nationalism, but I can't speak for other parties. I know that since the referendum applied, like the Greens and a lot of Labour and the Labour Party in Wales, do believe in stronger integration with Europe and ultimately rejoining. And I think it's maybe the two things go hand in hand, the sort of constitutional rearrangement of how the four nations of the UK work together. Because, yeah, it's an independent Wales or Scotland wouldn't stand on its own. And as you rightly say, it's the same is true for Wales, that the biggest bulk of trade is on that border. So you don't want to set up further obstacles. I think it does it, but it has opened up interesting questions about identity and how we see ourselves. Because one of the things that's always interested me is, in the beginning, I quite often would have thought of my earlier political career as the EU as a centralising project. I believe in decentralisation and devolution of power to the lowest possible level. But interestingly, that centralising project has created the space for, I feel, greater devolution, independence, call it what you will, amongst the different regions and small nations of Europe. And one of the reasons I would argue you need to be in Europe is to work with those other small nations and regions to help create the European future that we know is possible, and that, as you rightly highlighted and I mentioned, is under threat right now. So one last one from me, because I'm sure people have got things to say, is a very $6 million question. What do you see as the next steps? I mean, we're all the European movement across the UK and Wales for Europe are doing some incredible things. We've got our Erasmus Plus petition campaign going on, highlighting some of the absurdities of the Brexit situation. Very, very successful 5 years post-Brexit conference in Cardiff earlier this year with some very good speakers and really good discussion. But what is the next step? How do we push, would you say, for that greater integration and getting the public on board? And are we ultimately looking for another referendum? I know a lot of people would argue that a future referendum isn't the way back in, it's just a recipe for more division. So that's the last question from me.
Yeah, I think for answering your first part of the question, I think on the referendum issue, I'm not that comfortable with it, but I think if we do decide to rejoin, and I agree it could be very divisive, but I don't think there's any way back in without having a referendum. I think having left on the basis of a referendum, you would have to put it to the people again. And so we'd have to be well prepared. We'd have to be ready to be pretty confident we're going to get a comfortable majority. And I agree with you, the way that the tide has turned, I'm not suggesting we should have the referendum tomorrow, but the way the tide has turned, it's clear that more and more people are coming towards the idea that Brexit was a mistake. And when you build on the fact it was only about 0.5% we left by, that's a significant shift. The way forward, I think, is firstly to keep pushing, as you've been doing in Wales and as we're trying to do in Scotland, the public debate about Europe, not to allow it to die, to keep pushing the idea that there is support for membership of the European Union, to keep, without being remoaners, so the tone's got to be right here, but keep pointing out the cost of leaving the European Union. And that cost is both in terms of trade and monetary terms, but also issues that I know you're very concerned about, how it's made it it's made it more difficult for us to protect our environment, how we've lost cultural exchanges, educational opportunities, and even a voice in the global world at a time when the global world is very insecure. And I think we've got to keep pushing all of those agendas. And it's modest, and again, I don't want to exaggerate it, but we've actually seen, I think, I speak as a Labour Party member, but nevertheless, I think we've seen the Labour government being slightly more ambitious in Europe than I had feared. So already there is momentum is maybe not the right word, but there's a bit of movement. There's a bit of development coming along. And I thought the Lancaster House discussion and debate and outcomes were really quite encouraging. So I'm afraid it's incremental. I mean, it's not tomorrow, it's not next year. But I don't think it's 20 or 30 years anymore. And one time I did think it was 20 or 30 years. But beyond saying it's not next year or the year after, and it's not 20, 30 years, I'm not sure when it is, but we just need to keep building.
And that's, again, really encouraging. And I have to agree with you. Wales for Europe is a cross-party group and people of no parties as well. And yes, absolutely credit where it's due. The shift under the new Labour government, this is one area where they are going in the right direction, I would argue, and it's very welcome. And I'm sure it's been incredibly welcomed by our European neighbours and counterparts that the clowns have left the room. We're actually talking and trying to work things out, a way forward, which might not go as far as some of us would like, as quickly as we would, but it's definitely a vast improvement. And as I said, all credit to the current government for that. How do you want to do this, Charles? Do you want to chair the questions and we'll answer whoever asks, whatever is asked of us? Is that the best way forward? You're muted, Charles. There.
Sorry, that's the first time that's ever happened to me. I've spoken while I'm muted. Very strange. Okay, if you're saying that now is the time for a bit of a Q&A, that's fine. Can't see any.
I'm happy. I can carry the politician. I can carry on talking, but I think just
Great. I was about to say that I can't see any hands raised, but Geraint has raised his hand, so that's excellent. Thank you, Geraint. Come in, please.
I'm on it. Right. Geraint Howard Davis. I chaired Wales for Europe during the referendum campaign, so bear the scars, as do we all. But can I just put some propositions to you? You know, and it's going to sound very, very pessimistic, but I think some focused pessimism may be required. I think, and Brexit, you know, reversing Brexit seems to be a very long way off, and I think saying that Brexit is a mistake, you know, doesn't necessarily mean that you know that the automatic rejoin case is there. I think the thing that I think is going to shift things is not so much a gradual change of public opinion. It's going to take some events that we can't foresee to actually suddenly shake the dice again. And I think that so those are two things. You know, what events might actually shake up things in a way that brings this on. And the third point I wanted to make is I do worry that we have this discussion in Wales and Scotland without discussing England sufficiently. When you look at what is happening in England with the growth of Farage's party, we have a Labour government with a huge majority elected on a minority of the votes. You have two different situations in Scotland and Wales, where in the Scottish Parliament elections next year, it's not clear to me what will happen in that. It is clearer to me, I suppose, in partly because I live in Wales, that the impact of Farage and reform in Wales next year is going to be very significant. And I think when you throw that into the mix, how do we navigate through that to, you know, a more optimistic situation? What can we actually do other than, you know, waiting for events and keeping our fingers crossed?
Who wants to go first?
Llaw I lawr, Geraint.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in on that. Some really good points there, and I think you're right about events are going to change things, and things could change very, very quickly, either in a good way or a bad way, depending on events. And I think we've had an example of that, haven't we, in recent years with the situation in Ukraine, which has highlighted the need for cooperation and unity in Europe. And several years ago, none of us probably couldn't have foreseen that we'd actually be in this situation on the edges of the EU. And I think it also raises interesting questions about where next for NATO, when one of the leading NATO members is talking about annexing Greenland. Where does that leave that alliance? So I think there's a lot of work to be done on rethinking alliances, and I think absolutely believe we need to be at the heart of the EU to help build a peaceful Europe and a peaceful planet. But it is those changes, and then obviously the big change, the big elephant in the room that I'd also refer to, the climate and nature emergencies, are going to proceed at pace, and that could have a good impact, could have a bad impact. It could fall, and that overlaps with the rise of reform, because I'm really worried that we're going to see 10 months of election campaigning, definitely here in Wales, with people going on about stupid net zero. That's what they're going to campaign on. They're going to try and pay, and it's going to be so divisive and damaging to Welsh political landscape. But hopefully, it will focus people's minds. So I agree with you. It's definitely events could change things very, very quickly, because as we recognise and we welcome the fact that more and more people are aware of the damage done by Brexit, that doesn't translate automatically into let's rejoin Europe, especially when we've got these snake oil salesmen who are selling distrust and cynicism about political structures and parties. And I think, yes, England is crucial to this discussion. And I can't remember who it was the other day, there was a really good piece, I think in the Observer, but they're talking about the constitutional settlement. None of this stuff can happen in isolation. And I think also, I say this to colleagues in my own party in England, our Senate elections, I can't speak to the Scottish elections, are a dry run for the next general election, because we've got a reform far-right populist party on the rise and a Labour Party somewhat in disarray and about to lose their grip, their long-standing grip on power in Wales. And I wish I knew how this was going to play out. We're spending a lot of time, as I'm sure other progressive parties are, trying to figure out the best way. How do we tell our story? What narrative do we put out there to combat this populist anti-establishment line that's been taken, which was used, I mean, they've taken all the lessons from Brexit and they're now applying them to internal UK politics, aren't they? As well as this net zero stuff, we're going to hear lots of stuff about the gravy train, too many Senate members, we're going to see attacks on the Welsh language. And we have to be really clever in how we counter that, because the political landscape, if the political landscape changes in the pessimistic way that it could, it will take us a long time to get back to a hopeful place. So I think, yeah, focused pessimism is a good phrase, Geraint. We've got a lot of work to do to counter that.
Thank you, Anthony. David, please.
Yeah, I kind of understand the point about an event changing the dynamics. To some extent, we've already had these events, and they are shaping the dynamic to some extent. Trump has made people less trustful of America, and we should bear in mind that although Trump is obviously an outlier, and he's not an outlier, he's an extreme example. The US has been moving away from Europe and the UK for quite a long time now, 20, 30 years. Even under Obama, they were moving towards Asia, and pre-Obama with Bush and so on, there was a movement away from Europe, and that doesn't immediately trigger a reaction from the public, but they are slowly realizing this, they're waking up to this, and they don't feel comfortable being isolated, and I think they understand. I mean, the support for Britain being part of a European Defence Force, again, it's not the same as saying we should be part of the EU. It has been really strong, and indicates that people would feel safer being part of a wider alliance, and they no longer trust the existing alliance. I think and that kind of links into the Ukraine war that Alistair has mentioned. But I think the other thing, and this might sound counterintuitive, but the whole uncertainty that Farage is bringing and the possibility of him winning power actually would make a lot of people, sensible people in the centre, think again, if we want to anchor our democracy, the European Union is a place to do that. So they could actually see EU membership as a safeguard against the extremes that Farage might attempt to impose upon us. I don't run away from the fact that we've got an extremely difficult set of elections next year. Elena Morgan herself wrote recently in Labour List that for 100 years, 3 things have been certain: death, taxes, and Labour victories in Wales. And the third one is now under serious question. The same in Scotland. 18 months ago, I would have thought a Labour government in Scotland was a shoo-in. Now, but actually, I was going to say without increasing their vote, with actually seeing their vote decline, the SNP might win again, but they might need the votes of, we might not have a stable government because the UKIP, harking back, the Farage team might have too big a grouping to make it possible for any coalition, stable coalition to be formed.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Bring Richard Jones in now then, please, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed. I did put a question in the chat column just before the Q&A started, but shall I read it out?
Yeah.
You talked about the government taking a more moderate approach towards the European Union, but it is held up by its red lines on the single market, the customs union, the freedom of movement, supposedly because of fear of reactions in English red wall seats. But do those red lines have the same weight in Scotland or Wales? Or do you have rather other issues to take up?
If I kick off on that one, I don't think the government certainly has said it's not going to join the internal market or the customs union. But if you actually look at what was agreed recently in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary terms, in terms of some of the EU programs, in terms of some of the common agricultural policy agreements, the energy agreements, and so on, and the basis that these agreements have been reached, which is actually clever wording, but essentially evolving the European Court, not directly, but through another body in European and UK law, which was one of the red lines. I think we can see a lot of the red lines fraying, if not crumbling, at the present time. Up in Scotland, I wouldn't say they are top of the agenda. One of the things that is very high in the agenda, which is also agreed, or we hope was agreed, with the details are still to be thrashed out, is the youth mobility programme, because we definitely need more young people from the European Union coming to Scotland. And we have suffered because of Brexit, and not least our university sector, where I'm told it's something like, it's almost now 90% down compared to 2016, the number of EU students coming to Scotland. Now that, of course, is because they came for free. So it's exaggerated. It's not just the free movement aspect, but it's the fact that they now have to pay fees. But nevertheless, that has been massively damaging to the higher education sector in Scotland. And I would say that's mobility is probably, where we disagree or differ most from the rest of the UK, because we need people to come to Scotland, both in terms of education, but also in terms of the hospitality sector, the farming sector, and because without inward immigration, we've got a declining population because of low birth rates and high age profile. So, one of the things Anna Sarwar, leader of the Labour Party in Scotland, has been talking about to the UK government is whether we can have a bespoke agreement for Scotland. I think it's unlikely, but it hasn't been entirely ruled out. And it's not impractical either, because the way they do it, for example, is in Canada, is certain provinces are allowed higher levels of immigration, providing through housing and other work permits, they stay in those provinces. So they don't get in the province and they can go anywhere in Canada. And the same could apply to Scotland. You could come to Scotland on the basis of you're going to reside in Scotland. Wouldn't be easy to monitor, but it would be a way forward, a way of allowing Scotland to attract inward migration. And in the longer run, my hope is, because I don't particularly want Scotland to be exceptional here, hopefully to ease the whole fear behind immigration for the UK as a whole.
Thank you, David. Anthony, so the question is to do with red lines. Do we have red lines of the same sort as Northern England here in Wales?
Perhaps not to the same extent. And another thing that is frustrating, I often see my job to be a critical friend when governments and political parties are doing the right thing, but perhaps not being brave enough. And I do worry that quite a lot of those red lines exist only in the minds of the government. And to get elected with that majority, which we could have a whole other conversation about the unfairness of the voting system, that you can get such a big majority with such a small share of the vote. But then that was the moment to be really brave. And I think immigration is one of the crucial, I agree with David so much on the immigration issue. We need politicians of all parties and governments at every level to be open and honest about what a benefit immigration is. We need to take that narrative out of Farage's hands. People, it's going to be an interesting one to see how Reform use that in some of the Welsh constituencies where they think they could do well, because immigration isn't an issue in those seats, but they will make it be perceived to be an issue. So I think it's always welcoming steps in the right direction. And again, going back to my earlier comment, we're in such a better place than we were before last year's general election. And I see our job as campaigning organisations, as political parties, is to push the government to go that bit further. And I think there's a willingness. My reading of the situation is there is a willingness in the Labour government, UK Labour government, to do that. And the Welsh Labour government is very proud, and rightly so, of its initiative of being a nation of sanctuary. And so we need to push that further and make that mean something in reality. Make the people of Wales aware of that position and that this is what the nation that we want to be. So it's a lot of work to do in getting these narratives across, but never ever has been more crucial. And the youth mobility scheme, absolutely, Wales is suffering as well. I mean, we've got the tithe scheme, which is slightly better than the touring scheme, but we speak to so many people. We've got this big event coming up later this year in September, I think it is, focusing on the youth mobility scheme and rejoining Erasmus Plus. And that's where it comes back to the timidity of governments. I can't see why rejoining Erasmus Plus would be a red line for a government. It's such an easy win. It's focusing on young people. It's young people's future that we've taken away from them. It's such an easy win, and it's such a good way into showing the positive side of further integration and stronger ties.
Erasmus Plus will just be about money in the end. The European movement is supporting it. So,
Okay, thank you, Anthony.
Oh, sorry, could I just add? I forgot to say the one example of good practice, especially from my perspective, is the recent UK-EU agreement on environment and energy. That campaign that shows the strengths, and it shows that there are things that we can do even while we haven't regained full membership of the EU. But that was a very, very welcome step, and I'm, again, credit where it's due. Very, very pleased to see that happening.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Can we bring David Gowen now then, please?
Yes.
David.
Hello. Yes, very nice to be, so to speak, back in Wales as a former inhabitant of Dinas Powys and a member of what Denzil Davies, the former Labour MP, used to call the Dinas Powys chattering with people like John Osmond and Robin Reid back in the day. Anyway, I worked a lot here in Scotland. I'm speaking from Gloucestershire with people like David Martin. I know those, including at the RSE, where I chair the Scotland and Europe initiative at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Anyway, I'm interested in what David had to say about the Scottish government, which, as he correctly says, it has a policy of dynamic alignment with EU regulation, and it has sought to distinguish itself from the UK government in that sense by basically saying, they would follow, insofar as in devolved areas, they would do as much as they possibly could to align with EU regulation. And as David says, in environment field, I'm afraid to say it hasn't happened. Ironically, the UK government actually is. I mean, I think I was talking this weekend with my colleague Michael Keating, who many of you probably know as a Professor Keating, who's written an enormous amount about Europe and evolution and the constitutional change. And he was saying, actually, his experience too is that the UK government is aligning very heavily, I mean, almost stealthily, with what's going on in Brussels. And is effectively, it's actually accepting what they call the Brussels effect. The question is to both up to Anthony and to David, could we, given that the public as a whole, including reform voters, actually recognise that Brexit has been an economic disaster? Has not brought the benefits which was set out on the tin. Now, so is it possible that we could, as it were, creep almost back into Europe and almost, inevitably get it back in via a customs union and/or the single market, or does it need, as David was talking about, a big bang event, something like, for example, I don't know, say the Russians, for example, to invade the Baltics, and the Americans to say they weren't going to lift a finger to help the Baltics, or something like that. that kind of Big Bang event. What do you think?
Okay, do you want to come in first then, David?
Yeah, firstly, it's nice to see David Gow looking well after his recent health scare. So good to see you, David. Before I get to the second part, just on this environmental alignment, I think there are a variety of things going on in terms of the Scottish Government. One is, to be honest, getting the information required to keep up with European legislation is not easy for a devolved administration. It requires quite a bit of manpower, but frankly, they're not going to help themselves if they close down Scotland Europa and weaken their base in Brussels. Secondly, so information is a problem. Secondly, administrative capacity is a bit of a problem. Thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, there is the problem of the internal market and that we can't pass legislation that is contrary to the UK internal market. But you're right, David, there's also a political problem. And I was struggling as you were speaking to try and think of examples. I'm sorry, I can't. But I know of at least 2 or 3 cases, which I can't sadly name, where they've taken a political decision not to follow European legislation. So much for saying they were going to keep aligned with European legislation. That was a positive decision, if that's the right term, not to align with Europe. So there are a variety of factors running through their decision-making process, but politics is definitely a part of it. In terms of how we get back in, I'm afraid I'm a unreformed incrementalist. I think we just need to keep building. But, and this may be controversial, I'm not sure that rejoining the customs union is a way back in. I think it's very sensible in terms of economic policy. But my fear is if we rejoin the customs union, a large section of the population or a large section of the influential population, the business community and so on, might think we've now done enough and we don't need to rejoin the EU. We might end up in a Norway or a Switzerland situation. So I'd certainly believe in incrementally getting closer and closer, but there's a point where if we get too close, it might prevent us from actually ever rejoining. I'm less, as I probably indicated in answer to the previous question, I'm not entirely sure about a single Big Bang, but I think a number of events showing that we need to be involved and close to Europe will certainly help the process. I don't think it'll necessarily be one big boom and everybody says, oh God, let's get back into Europe tomorrow. Don't think it'll be quite like that.
Thank you, David. Anthony?
Yeah, progress is progress and has to be welcomed, and incremental alignment has to be a good thing. I take David's point. It's a very good point about we can get so far and then we think that's okay, that's sorted out business aspects that affect me. We don't need to go any further. But I think I'd counter that by saying when people see the advantages of closer alignment, they will want more. And in an increasingly uncertain world, I think that will be the case. Again, it goes back to the constitution. We have to sort out what the UK is to know how we want to interact with our European neighbours. One of the interesting things for me about the closer alignment with environmental standards is, and again, this is probably getting counterintuitive and the wrong group to say this to, but once we'd left the EU, there was actually an opportunity to put in place a better system for agriculture. And the European standards weren't as good as they could be or should be. And we've seen the UK government, and here in Wales, it's the recent relaunched sustainable farming scheme, we've seen them fudge that, which does indicate that, to me, that we actually need to be back in that bigger group, working with other people who agree with us on a better system for farming and agriculture and food production in the EU, and making that change happen, because it goes back to the red lines. And at a national level, our politicians have been perhaps slightly too timid. They've been badly burnt in the past. We've had 14 years of very confrontational government up until now. But it's that unity of purpose that will perhaps help us. And that's where the closer alignment comes into place, but also aligning and pushing for things to be better. And that's obviously the problem with not being a full member of the EU. We have no real control or influence on making those standards as good as they could and should be.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Before Caroline comes in, I'd like to abuse my position as chair, really, and take up that issue of the Big Bang event that might change things radically. I can think of 2 or 3 sorts of big bang events. Who knows how likely any of these are to be? And I think that's the only correct answer to any question about future politics these days. The only correct answer is to say, who knows? Because we don't know. You know, we couldn't have imagined really what's happening in the United States 15 or 20 years ago. But one possible big bang event is that 3 years hence, the Labour government suddenly realizes that its ambition of growth is absolutely hopeless and failing, and some really radical rethink has to be made about rejoining. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that we, in 4 years' time, not 5, we have a reform government in the UK with Nigel Farage as Prime Minister. Who's to say it's not going to happen? We're all praying to God it doesn't happen. And here's another one, which I would have said has got a 15, 20 or 30-year time frame. But again, nowadays, who knows? One of the 3 votes in a referendum for independence, the 3 being Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland. I would have put my money on Northern Ireland first, Scotland second, and Wales trailing at a very long last. But the polling for next May's Senedd looked very, very favourable towards Plaid Cymru. So again, who knows? But any responses to any of those big bangs? Am I just a mad person shouting words in the street, or is there any sense behind any of those?
Like as you say, making any predictions in politics these days is rather foolish, more foolish than it's ever been. But you know, the point you made about economic growth is, I don't want to be, well, am I being pessimistic? I don't know. I think I'm being realistic. We're not going to get the levels of economic growth that Labour wants as things currently stand. And pretty recent figures, we all know about the decline in physical trade, that the figures for that have been so well floated. But what has been coming out recently is contrary to expectations, even in services. We're not just seeing a marginal decline, but we're seeing a 4 or 5% decline in our ability to provide services inside the European Union. And that is causing enormous damage. So the dog that hasn't barked, you're right, every budget so far, or economic statement, there's only been a couple under this government so far, but the dog that hasn't barked so far is the fact that the Chancellor is constrained. Chancellor's constrained because we're not members of the European Union. Whether, and I doubt it, I have to say I don't think this will happen, but if I was a Labour strategist and I get to 3 or 4 years' time, as you've just indicated, we haven't had the growth, looks like we're going to have a terrible election, I would polarise the election by saying Labour will rejoin the EU and make it us against Farage. And in that sense, I think we could win. But that said, I repeat, I don't think they're going to do it, but I think that would be the bold and dramatic thing to do. But yeah, I'm not optimistic on it, unfortunately.
Thanks for that, David. Anthony, any thoughts?
Finally, quick, those are 3 very big events. Growth is the tricky one because there's the essential argument, how does the government measure growth, which is deeply flawed at the moment anyway, but also using that as an indicator of whether we should go back or will the Labour government get re-elected. What is worrying is if they can, with the standards that they use, the deeply flawed standards that they use for measuring growth in a very unsustainable world, the nature of climate crisis we've referred to, we can't carry on business as usual. We have to find new ways of doing things and new ways of growing. We need to see a growth in good industries. We need to see a growth in health and well-being. But there's a danger that if the Labour government can turn around, because it seems to matter to them so much, and they're up to elections, say, if the figures show that the UK has had 0.5% more growth than some of the European neighbours, they will boast about that, and that will reduce the desire. That will be have a negative effect on the campaign to rejoin the EU. The independent reform government, God help us. It's the one thing that I do take some hope from is when we had them and UKIP got into the Senate and then they splintered and turned into abolish the Assembly, the UKIP party, the Brexit party. they were only there for one term. People saw them for what they were. They are not capable of delivering. We're hopefully going to see some side impact of that from the councils that they now control in England. They're already, by recent reports, starting to tear themselves apart in Wales, and they haven't even been elected yet. But it could be the wake-up call our politics needs. That this is what happens if you're complacent. This is what happens if you pander to right-wing narratives. If you don't stand up, and I agree 100% with David here, going into a government opposing Farage, then we will join the EU. You know, we will have a humane and compassionate refugee policy, asylum seekers policy, to actually say those things out loud and give people that clear choice. You know, because people are being fed a narrative that no one is really challenging, and it's time for the parties of the left, progressive parties, centrist parties, to actually start making that case. I think that is a strong, and if reform don't make us wake up, I don't know what will. And one thing that does worry me, as someone like many of you in this room with a long experience of campaigning before the referendum and post-referendum, is the way people are dismissing reform voters. We have to be very, very careful about that. There's this idea of just painting there's this group of stupid people over there. Reform are tapping into insecurity, fear, and anger. But that fear and anger is justifiable in many cases. So we have to find a way of addressing that and answering that. I think on the three nations, I think you're probably right. Northern Ireland, Unified Islands are probably the most likely one to happen first. But as I've said earlier, I think that does just open up a bigger discussion, because no one can go off on their own. I mean, Ireland is a slightly different case, but Scotland and Wales, there has to be a settlement with England. There has to be some way of taking that forward. But I think, and it's interesting, David Gow's comment earlier on has made me pause on this one, because I sort of too often conflate the desire for greater power, greater devolution, not necessarily independence, with a desire to be back in Europe. And David was right to highlight that for some people, that independence is the be all and the end all. And we do get some pushback as why do you want to, as pro-independence, and I know my Scottish colleagues in the Scottish Greens get it as well. Why do you want to leave the UK, but you want to rejoin the EU? Isn't there a contradiction there? So there's a lot to unpick in that as well. But all of those three, problem is, the worrying thing is all of your three big events are quite plausible and possible.
Thank you, Anthony. Caroline, do you want to come in, please?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. All of you have touched on the link between devolution and membership of the EU throughout the evening, and personally, I'm quite concerned that the strong link that's been there between those dual forces over many years is not strong enough at the moment, and I'm disappointed after the general election that the current Labour government isn't being strong enough in respecting devolution and supporting the devolved governments and working with them. And I'll give you two examples, both of which link to our links currently and previously with the European Union. So, for example, when we left the EU, the UK government at the time, the Conservatives, set up the Shared Prosperity Fund, Levelling Up Fund. It's been called various things. And I had hoped that after the general election, a Labour government would have devolved responsibility for those regional funds back to the devolved nations. And certainly that hasn't happened in Wales. We still have UK government, the Wales office, actively managing those funds and promoting them, including the current Secretary of State for Wales, in a way which I think is rather disrespectful of Welsh Government and its powers and its responsibility for the past 25 years for economic development and regeneration. And the second example is the recent EU-UK summit around the trade and cooperation agreements. What we've heard, we provide secretariat support for the Senedd cross-party group for Europe. And what we've heard over the past few meetings is that really the UK government hasn't allowed the devolved nations to have sufficient voice in the negotiations at any stage in the run-up to the May summit, during the summit, and I can only assume since then as well. And without a proper voice, particularly on, when they're discussing devolved areas, that really does undermine devolution for me. And I'm just wondering, given that a number of you have touched on the links between devolution and European integration during the evening, what, do you agree with my analysis there, or do you have a different perspective?
Sadly, I agree with you. I would like to. I wish it was different, but the EU, through its regional funds in the 80s, I think even before we had formal devolution in the UK, actually meant you had the then Welsh and Scottish office were running the countries from the Westminster government basis, but nevertheless they then got significant funds separate from the UK Treasury that they could use and put Scottish and Welsh priorities in place. And after devolution, of course, that was completely reinforced in that the devolved regions administered all of this. And of course, it's not just funds, you're right, it was many other aspects of policy where they were consulted on or where they had autonomy because they had devolved responsibilities, and that devolved responsibility related to a European competence. And a lot of that is being, if not eroded, it's disappearing even in some cases. And I think it's all very sad. I think what's equally sad though, and again, Alistair mentioned earlier about how we can influence developments at the European Union level. I think we should let our colleagues abroad know that the von der Leyen's idea that regional funds would no longer be regional funds, that EU funds like the regional and the social fund should just go to central government, which she announced in the recent multi-annual financial framework. It's not been agreed yet and it's been opposed by many, but I think we should add our voice to how bad that would be and let people know just how beneficial those devolved funds were to Wales, to Scotland, to the northwest of England and to Northern Ireland, and really suggest that keeping a devolved element is so important for the European Union, but also agree, continue to fight for devolved issues inside the UK remains vital.
Thank you, David. Anthony?
Yeah, I have to agree 100% with Caroline. It's been one of the most disappointing and quite confusing, strange things to watch is the new UK government's attitude towards devolution, and even within Welsh Labour, the tensions between the parliamentary Welsh Labour Party and the Senate members in the Welsh government. And I've got to say, I have some sympathy for Welsh government ministers, up to including the First Minister, when they are being told to get back in their box, more or less. And things that are Welsh Labour policy, the devolution of the Crown Estate, fairer funding for Wales, being told by Secretary of State from Cardiff that no, you're not going to get that. It's mind-boggling. It is incredibly disrespectful. It helps feed into all sorts of divisive narratives. And I think credit to some of the Welsh Labour politicians, they are highlighting it. They're in a very difficult spot and they're facing this falling off the cliff edge next year, partly due to their colleagues in Westminster not respecting the devolution settlement and not working towards taking it further forward and making it fairer. So I think it is going to be a key part of why Welsh Labour quite probably do lose their first election ever next year. And it's very disappointing to see that, because we're a party that believes in the devolution power to the lowest possible level. So when I say Wales Green Party supports Welsh independence, it goes so much further than that. So independence is meaningless if you're just moving Westminster to Cardiff Bay. We want to put power in the hands of people and communities. And that's not just about funding, as important as funding is, it's also about the decision making. And it goes back to those imaginary red lines in perhaps the UK government's minds, that they can't be seen to pander to the devolved nations. And it's incredibly counterproductive and something that I find very disappointing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Are there any further questions? Okay, so we've got to the stage where we need to sum up. Would you like to say a few more words then to sum up, David?
Yeah, just very briefly. Firstly, thanks for the questions and thanks for the discussion, which I've enjoyed. I think the key for both the Welsh and the Scottish European movement is to keep pressing the case for Europe. And I agree with Alistair. Of course, it is a bit about the economy, but it's also about what type of economy. So it's not just growth for growth's sake, and it has to be environmentally friendly growth. And so on. But we have to keep making the case that we've lost out economically by not being part of the European Union. We have to keep making the case that we are weaker in terms of global affairs. And we haven't mentioned it because it's not been germane to the discussion tonight, but the British people, I find, wherever I go, are furious about what's going on in Palestine and the lack of proper government reaction. And again, I think nevertheless there's an understanding a united European Union, and it hasn't been united so far, but a united European Union could have done much more in terms of pressing for change in the situation in the Middle East. We have to make it clear, as we did for decades, but perhaps the message is getting lost. And Alison mentioned the fear about net zero being a negative issue or try to be used as a negative issue in the coming elections. We have to make it clear that if we want to improve our environment, the only way to do it is through European cooperation and a European Union leading global change on environmental issues. And again, we've kind of mentioned it in passing, but Europe is still probably the key area in terms of setting out good values on it's got its weaknesses, but good values on human rights, on human decency, on democracy, and so on. And again, we're living in a world where you look across the Atlantic, some of that is disappearing. You look to China, you look to Russia, we're facing a lot of threats. And again, we need to make the point that Europe collectively and together has a chance of resisting the current global trends of might being right, which is for me, very disturbing, that simply bullying your way to get what you want is becoming the norm in global affairs, and the whole rules-based system is fraying at the edges, if not collapsing.
Thank you, David. Anthony.
Yeah, again, a lot to agree with, and it's that collapsing of global morality, global systems. And exactly as David said, the EU has its flaws when it comes to human rights and international affairs, but it's still the best show in town. It's still the best place for tackling those issues. Again, highlighting why it's so important that we are there at the heart of that. And I think, just also to thank everyone for being here, the questions, the discussion. It's been incredibly thought-provoking. It's been incredibly useful. It's always good to think these things through and challenge one's own assumptions. So thank you everyone for that. And I'd just also like to thank Joe for all the work he does in putting these events together, and Charles and Gareth for opening it. It's been, I think one of the takeaways for me as well, going back to Caroline's points about devolution, is one thing we can do as campaigners is our colleagues in England and the wider UK European movement, to make them aware of these issues, of the specific impacts on the devolved nations, so that feeds back, and then that will feed back, because again, European movement is cross-party political, that will feed back into other groups, other discussions. So I think we need to keep raising that issue of the overlap between the disaster that is Brexit, the economic effects it's having, but also how it has damaged democracy in the devolved nations. I think that's an important thing for us as well as for Europe and our colleagues in Scotland, to get that message across as often as possible. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I was going to say. I did forget to ask in the beginning if we had a collective noun for presidents.
That's a dangerous question.
Okay, thanks for that, Anthony. So write your suggestions for the collective noun on a postcard and send them in. One of the assumptions that I've had challenged this evening is I had a sort of leisurely assumption that London, Scotland, Northern Ireland, devolved places, automatically were very European as well. So I'm surprised to hear that there's a group of nationalists who are sort of believe in balkanization, just being independent or self-governing, and then that's it. Just one tiny country in the big wide world. I find that quite surprising. On the other hand, Plaid Cymru were very anti-Europe in the first referendum, during Wilson's referendum, but very pro-Europe in the 1997 referendum. And my perception is very pro-Europe now. So it looks like possibly the Welsh government that's incoming will be more independent minded, but also more European minded as we go forward. But again, the correct thing to say about even next May is who knows. Anyway, thank you all for attending. It's a pretty good attendance, Joe. What's I've lost the I think it's over 30, so that's a pretty good attendance. Very well done. 32 says Joe. Thank you, Joe. Thank you to the officers of Wales for Europe for organising this, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks very much.